there's one aspect in the Sean Ryan interview where you spoke about, you just shed light about, there was some kind of study made on people where if you put some kind of pressure on certain parts of the brain, the soul or the spirit says, I want to come out of the body. Do you have more evidence or more information on that, like to prove to people that, what, life after death is actually true?
Yes. Yeah. And in the new book, in Imagine the God of Heaven, I mean, I have the evidence that convinced me in both books, in Imagine Heaven. And by the way, in the very first podcast that I do on the Imagine Heaven, it's called Imagine Heaven Podcast with John Burke. But
Okay.
I let you hear from these people, and I'm trying to show the reasons that I became convinced that there was life after death, and that it points to the God who revealed himself through Jesus. Why that's being testified to from people having near-death experiences all around the globe. So I'll give you, I put 10 points of evidence in Imagine the God of Heaven, but I'll just give you 3 of them, and you can see this in my first podcast. But the first one is verifiable observations. So this is what got my attention when I was still a skeptical engineer, and I was like, okay, how do I know these near-death experiences aren't just hallucinations? Or maybe it's a trick the brain's playing, as you're dying, it's flooding with neurotransmitters, the chemicals that flood your brain. Maybe it's just happening in the brain. But that does not, you can't explain it that way when you look at the evidence. And the first one is, when people die clinically, they say that they leave their physical body, but they still have a body. They have a spiritual body. And they say, it's not a body of just 5 senses. It's more like they have 50 senses. And so what I explain is, the best way to understand it is that I think these people are moving into dimensional realms that are all around us already, but we can't see because we're limited to 3 finite dimensions of space and 1 dimension of time, right? That's humanity. Yes. But imagine if we're living on a flat black and white painting in your room, right? And death means separation. So at death, then, this 2-dimensional self, because remember, the self can go up and down and side to side in 2 dimensions, but there is no in or out. There's no 3rd dimension in your world if you live in a 2-dimensional world. So death means separation. So imagine at death, your flat self is peeled off that flat painting and suddenly brought out into this room of 3 dimensions, and you're experiencing 3 dimensions. And you can also look back and see your old world because it's contained within this greater dimensional reality. So you would be able to see and describe what is going on there, but you're also experiencing 3 dimensions and color. And then imagine getting resuscitated, pressed back into your flat world. And now you have to describe 3 dimensions and color, but in 2-dimensional black and white terms.
Got it.
And that's what, as I've interviewed, over 1,000 people, they've said, oh, that's exactly what it's like. There aren't words in our language, but it also explains why people have verifiable observations. So they say they're out of their body, but many times they're still in the room where their resuscitation is happening. And as a result, when they're brought back, even though they might have been dead 25 minutes, one guy that I interviewed, he has the hospital records. He was dead 1 hour and 45 minutes. A spine surgeon I interviewed whose kayak got pinned under a waterfall, they couldn't find her body for 30 minutes. So she was dead 30 minutes. And yet they're able to watch what's happening in their resuscitation. So when they come back, they can describe and verify things that were actually happening in our realm, in our reality. And this grounds these experiences in our realm. I'll give you one example, a guy in Holland. So many doctors, medical doctors, cardiologists, oncologists, who were skeptical, just like I was as a skeptical engineer, have been convinced there is life after death when they have interviewed their patients. So one of them is a Dr. Pim van Lommel. He's a cardiologist in Holland. And there was a man brought into a Dutch hospital that he was at, and the man had been found in a park with no heartbeat, and it took 30 minutes to get him to the hospital. So he'd been dead at least 30 minutes. They were going to shock his heart, and they had to intubate him, and the nurse found dentures in his mouth. So she took the dentures out, put them in the lower drawer of the crash cart, and then they shocked him, got his heart going, but he never came to. He was comatose the whole time in the ER room. They took him to another room, and he came out of coma 1 week later. Okay, so when he comes out of coma, he's complaining, "You lost my dentures. You lost my dentures. Where are my dentures?" And then he sees a nurse, and he says, "That nurse knows where my dentures are." And then he describes how he was up above his body. He described every doctor and nurse in the ER and what they were doing, and how he was trying to get their attention and they couldn't hear him. And that nurse that took his dentures and put them in the lower drawer of that cart with all the bottles on it. And they went, and sure enough, that's where they found his dentures. Now, things that connect what these people are saying to real life verifiable observations have actually been studied. So Dr. Jan Holland did a study of close to 100 patients having a near-death experience, and each one may make 5 or 10 observations, right? And then she was able to check out how accurate their observations from out of their body, how accurate these observations were. She found that 96% of their observations were completely accurate. Another 6%, some of their observations might have been a little bit off. Only 2% of the observations, which turned out to be one patient in the study, were inaccurate. So this is, I mean, incredible. You can't explain how these people could know things when they had no brain waves. You know, if this is just happening in the brain.
Computer.
What was that?
It's not like the shutting of a computer.
No. And what they consistently say is, my soul survived my body's physical death.
Yes.
Now that's just one of the reasons. The second reason that I became convinced is that when people blind from birth have a near-death experience, they can see. And they describe seeing, and they report the same things that they saw in their near-death experience that sighted people do. And in this first podcast episode, I interviewed Brad Burrows, and he was 8 years old. He's been blind from birth. You know, he died for 4 minutes when he was 8 years old. They resuscitated him. He's still blind today. So he's never had a visual memory. And he talks about this. You can hear him talking about, he's never dreamed in pictures. He only dreams in touch and in smell and in sound, but he doesn't dream in pictures. He has no visual pictures. And yet when you hear him describe things like the light of heaven, and I've interviewed other blind people having near-death experiences, and here's what's fascinating, John. They describe the light of heaven, and they describe it like Vicky, this other blind person, and Brad said, you know, the grass and the trees and the flowers and the birds and even the people, everything. There was this light that was different than the light of the sun. And this light was love, and this light was life all together, and it was coming out of everything. It was giving life to everything. Well, think about it. A blind person on earth would have heard that light shines on things, not out of everything, right? And yet the prophet Isaiah, writing in 780 BC, okay? So 780 BC, this is before the Bhagavad Gita, right? I think that was around 500, wasn't it?
Yeah.
I don't even remember actually. The Vedas I know were more like 1500 BC. But
Mm,
he writes that in heaven there is no sun or moon, for the light of God is its light.
mm,
And then John, one of Jesus' disciples who was taken to see heaven, writes the book of Revelation. In Revelation
mm,
21, he says, he notices in the city there's no sun or moon. The glory of God is its light, and the Lamb, referring to Jesus, is its lamp, and the nations will walk, he said, in that light.
mm,
He said that they will walk in that light. Well, that's what blind near death experiencers all around the globe report. And it's
mm,
the same thing that Indians report having a near death experience. Same thing Australians and uh, Chin in China that that I report on. So how do you explain that if this is just in the brain? Because a
yes.
blind person would never have visual images of light coming out of everything, and they wouldn't have heard that on Earth.
Mm,
Third reason that convinced me um, is really what I wrote this new book, Imagine the God of Heaven, about. And that's because people from every religious background, every cultural background, having near death experiences, many of them see not only the reality of heaven and the reality of hell, but they also see and experience God. And they
mm,
experience this same God of light and love. He's not an impersonal force, He's the most personal, loving. The love they talk about, all of them, is something that our word love just doesn't do justice for.
mm,
They say things like, imagine taking all the love you've ever felt or had for a spouse, from a parent, from a grandparent, for your children, for your girlfriend or boyfriend, all of that, put it into one, and you have to multiply it by thousands of times, and that doesn't even express the feeling they have in the presence of this God.
mm,
And what I'm showing in Imagine the God of Heaven is that they are not experiencing the God or gods they would have expected.
mm,
So, for instance, Dr. Rajiv Parti, he grew up in India. He became a medical doctor. He lost all faith in God, gods, all that, and he was just interested in money. But he was a very good anesthesiologist. In fact, he became the chief anesthesiologist in California's Bakerfield Heart Hospital. So
mm,
he's the highest of his profession in anesthesiology. He brought many people back from death, and he had heard them talk about these things, about these near death experience commonalities of being out of their body, of traveling through a portal or a tunnel to this place of exquisite beauty with
mm,
this light that is otherworldly light, and having this welcoming committee of people who had died before them, and then this presence of this God of light and love. He thought it was all bogus. He thought
mm,
they're psychotic, and he would give them a antipsychotic drug.
mm,
And then he had a near-death experience himself. Now, this is wild if you think about it. He had a near-death experience. And he
mm,
told me, he said, I had not become a good person. He said, I
mm,
just saw my patients as a way to make money and get a bigger house and a nicer car. I didn't treat them well. He had a very abusive father, and he had started to be abusive,
mm,
verbally toward his son. He had become addicted to different opioids because of this chronic problem that ultimately led to his near-death experience.
mm,
But in his experience, he begins in the experience of hell. And he describes it just like, and by the way, in some studies, 23% of people coming forward reporting near death experiences report hellish near death experiences. So many
mm,
report heavenly, but they also report the reality of this hellish place. Now, he called it
mm,
Naraka. That's that's the Hindu word for the Hindi word for hell, right? And he said, you know, what is my karma? Why am I here? And he heard, you've not been a very loving person. And he told me, he said, I was repenting. I was asking God to forgive me. He said, I realized my sins and I realized I hadn't pursued God. And he said, I was repenting. And then he said, these two angels from the Bible come and rescue him and take him through this tunnel to this place of exquisite beauty. And there in this place, he experiences this God of light. He describes, and this is the same as people all around the world, this God of light, brighter than the sun, like 1,000 times brighter, and yet not hard to look at, mesmerizing. You just wanted to be in his presence and look at him. And he says to him, Rajiv, I'm going to send you back. But first, I want you to understand your life better. And he gives him a life review. Now, a life review is another commonality that people get all around the globe. And because time does not work the same way on the other side. And I'm showing how all these things are biblical. Like in 2 Peter 3:8, Peter says, and he's actually quoting one of the Old Testament prophets, to the Lord, a day is like 1,000 years and 1,000 years is like a day. Well, you know what? That's exactly what near-death experiencers say. I don't know if it was minutes or years that I experienced it, because time doesn't work the same on the other side. So they re-experience their lives. They see and they experience it all over again, but they experience not only from their own perspective, their own thoughts and feelings and what was happening, they experience the thoughts and feelings of the people they interacted with. And they see how every act of kindness, how it affected that person, and how it even rippled through humanity, and also how their mean acts or their, unjust acts, how that affected that person and rippled through humanity. It's exactly what Jesus said in Matthew 25. He said, one day every single person will stand before the King of the universe. And then he will say, to the unrighteous to my left, to the righteous to my right, and he'll say to the righteous, he'll say, enter my kingdom, for when I was hungry, you fed me, and when I was naked, you clothed me, and when I was hurting, you visited me, when I was in prison, you came to see me, and all these things. And they'll say, when did we do that for you, Lord? And he'll say, we did it to the least of these brothers or sisters, the least deserving person, right? The outcast on the streets. When you did it to one of these, you did it to me. And in these near-death experiences, in the life review, they see that how they treated others affected the Lord himself. It's wild. So all these things that are biblical, they are testifying to. So Rajiv has this near-death experience, and he comes back and he is seeking. And he's saying, who was this God of light and love and such compassion and mercy? I thought he was going to send me back to hell. I saw my sins. I knew that's what I deserved. And yet he gave me such love and such mercy and kindness. And this was not like the Hindu gods I knew. And so he's seeking. And another point in time, his friend Naresh was dying of cancer about a year later. And he's sharing about this God of light and love who had mercy and forgiveness. And he had actually, interestingly, Rajiv had actually ended up going to a church and getting baptized.
Oh.
Now, actually, I don't know if it was before this event, because what happened is the night Naresh died of cancer, Rajiv wakes up. He is completely awake. And then he sees the heavens open, and there is Naresh with the same God of light and love.
Wow.
And he asked, Lord, who are you? And he said, Rajiv said to me, out of the light steps a man with shoulder-length hair and a beard and this majestic glowing robe, who holds out his arms and says, "I'm Jesus, your savior." And he drops to his knees. And I think it was after that he went and was baptized. Now I report on people all across the globe. Another one who became a good friend of mine from India was Santosh Akarchi. He was also an engineer. And he has, and I won't go into the whole thing. You can actually hear Santosh. I interviewed him on my podcast, so you can hear it and see him say it there. And you can also read his full story in Imagine the God of Heaven. But he thought, when I die, it's either just unplug the computer, nothing, or maybe I'll come back as another life form. You know, he grew up in India. That's all he knew. And he said, but that's not what happened. He hears code blue. His heart had stopped. His heart had stopped for many minutes, and he was in a medical induced coma for 3 days. He said, this brilliant God of light comes to him. He said, I knew this was a divine light, and I fell in love with this divine light because I knew he was for me. Then he takes him to this place, and Santosh describes looking out over what he described to me as a giant compound. Okay, so I've been to India, so I know, you know, it was a giant gated compound. Well, there are many gated, you know, complexes or compounds in India, right? Or at least I've been many times to Hyderabad or Rajahmundry, and anyway, they are there. And that's what he was describing. But he said, but thousands of miles in a square shape and just gorgeous inside. He said, I was up above looking into it. And there were gardens and fountains and beautiful landscape and mansions, these buildings of, he called it otherworldly building material. And he said, I long to go into this place. He's describing the New Jerusalem. He's describing this holy city of God exactly like John did in Revelation 21. And Santosh said there were 12 gates. I counted them. He said, now the other thing you have to realize, and this is a commonality, is your eyesight is like telescopic on the other side. Like you can see for miles, for thousands of miles, as if right up close. Which again, Christians might not realize is actually biblical. Now, when I first heard this, I was like, oh, that's kind of weird. And then God shows me in Revelation 21, when John is describing the holy city, he says the Spirit takes him up to a very high mountain that's above the city. Now, interestingly, you can also hear in my podcast, I interview a commercial airline pilot, Captain Dale Black. And he said he sees the same city, describes it, and there were mountains more majestic than the Himalayas that were up above and around the city. John says he's up on one of those mountains, and yet he reads the names on the foundation stones of the city. How? Well, because you have telescopic eyesight. And Paul described all this, by the way. You know, Paul may have had a near-death experience. In Acts chapter 14, it says that he was stoned to death in Lystra and left for dead. And then he gets back up and goes back into the city. And the believers were praying for him, and he gets back up. And then he says in 2 Corinthians 12, 14 years ago, whether I was in my body or out of my body, I don't know. But I was taken up to paradise. I was taken up to the third heaven, and I saw and heard things inexpressible. So I think he might have had a near-death experience when he was stoned to death in Lystra. So he describes a lot of these same things. And he says that when our bodies die, they're buried a natural body, but they're raised a spiritual body. They're buried in weakness, but they're raised in duname, is the Greek word, power. It's the word dynamite. We get our word dynamite. So these new powers of telescopic vision and things like that. So Santosh perfectly describes the holy city of God. And then he's like, where am I? And he looks down to his left, and he said he sees this abyss of darkness that if he falls down there, he will drop into a lake of fire. And he said, I knew that is hopeless. He's describing a vision of hell. And he said, I didn't want to go there. I wanted to go in the city, but I wasn't given the option of reincarnation, and I didn't know what to do. And then I turn and I look, and he sees a throne and this giant who he knows is God, but in the form of a man. And he looks up at his face, and he said he had eyes like lightning. And he had feet like glowing metal, glowing bronze, Santosh said. Well, he's describing the risen Jesus, just like Daniel did in Daniel chapter 7, and just like John does in Revelation chapter 1. And as soon as he looks into his eyes, his whole life flashes before him, and he realizes, I have sinned so badly, I deserve hell. And he falls to his knees and he says, Lord, please forgive me. Please forgive me. And then when the Lord speaks to him, he's shocked, because he said, Santosh, I'm sending you back to the earth. And when I send you back, you must love your family, love your children. And he said there was such mercy and compassion and tenderness and love from the Lord. He thought, I deserve hell. Why is he not sending me there? And yet he felt this compassion from God. And then they have this incredible conversation where Santosh sees a very narrow gate. So he sees these 12 gates, and they're all closed to him. But then he sees a very narrow gate right next to this throne, and it's open to him into the kingdom of heaven. And because the Lord was so compassionate and tender to him, he says, Lord, when I come back, I want to go through that narrow gate. Show me, tell me, how do I go through that narrow gate? And the only thing the Lord said to him is, Santosh was thinking, which religion, what religious practices do I do? And the Lord said, I want to see how honest you are with me. How honest is your relationship with me? Not one day a week, but 365 days a year. Walk with me in complete surrender. So Santosh comes back, and he too is seeking. He's like, who is this God? I knew he was God, but he was not like the gods I've learned about in the Bhagavad Gita or the Vedas, or he knew me inside and out. He loved me so much, and yet I knew I deserved to be sent to hell. And so he's wanting to know, who is this God of compassion, and he's praying every day. Now you have to remember, John, God tells us in the Old Testament, if you seek me with all your heart, you will find me.
True.
Right? And he is the God who searches the hearts. It says in Chronicles, he searches the hearts. His eyes roam about the earth, searching for hearts who are completely his. So if someone is seeking the true God with all their heart, they're going to find him. And that's what happened with Santosh. 2 years later, his daughter is invited to sing in a choir with a friend at a church. He goes to hear her. And the message that day, he walks in and he feels the same loving presence that he felt in the light of God. The message that day is Matthew 7, where it says, you must enter the kingdom of heaven through the narrow gate. And John 10, where Jesus says, I am the gate for the sheep. Yes, I am the gate. Whoever enters in through me will be saved. The
And
thief comes to steal and kill and destroy, but I have come to give them life abundantly.
mm,
And so, and those are just two of the people from India. But I
mm,
also interviewed a Muslim woman in Tehran
mm,
who describes the same God of light, who it comes as a man, and
mm,
says to her, "I am he who is." And
mm,
boom, she's back in her body, but with a peace and a joy she's never felt before. And she's like, "Who is this God who said, 'I am he who is'?" And by
mm.
the way, he spoke this in Persian, and
Okay.
she spoke it to me in Persian because she doesn't know English. It was translated to me in English, "I am he who is,"
Mm,
when she had this near-death experience. And she starts seeking and realizes, oh my gosh, the same God of light appeared to Moses on Mount
mm,
Sinai and said, I am the self-existent one. I am who I am, or I am he who is.
mm,
So I interview people, professors, spine surgeons, commercial airline pilots, doctors, lawyers, people who have nothing to gain making up these wild stories. And yet
mm,
consistently they're giving verifiable observations.
mm,
They're talking about common elements that
mm,
they didn't know existed.
mm,
And they're also meeting the same God that has revealed himself throughout the Jewish prophets and through Jesus. None
mm.
of that, none of those three things alone cannot be explained if these are just in the brain.
True. Mm. Wow, you shared a lot, and we just have like hardly 15 more minutes. So I just want to be more quick in the next couple of things I want to talk to you about. There's so much to think, and many of the stories I already listened. So the minute you said about Santosh, I think I've listened to it a couple of times, and even the Persian story. And I was also reminded of that Rwanda case. A boy, I think he died, and he came back
Sweetie.
after a day or two.
Yes,
Um,
Sweetie.
and then
Yeah.
I think now there have been like some 7 or 8 attempts on his life, including his dad wants to stop him because he's a preacher. So this is one thing, guys. I want you to understand that the reason I wanted to talk about these stories is to let you know that people of different faiths, different nationalities, different backgrounds have all come back with one commonality, that whom they saw was the God of the Bible.